where do our words come from? Or for that matter, where does the English language come from? In just a moment, we're going to answer those questions by going back to the year 1 AD to trace the development and the spread of the English language through 2,000 years of history. In our last program, we did some detective work. You may remember that we were actually able to move back in time and space, to reconstruct from clues that we had of languages that we had records of, to reconstruct languages that nobody had ever heard, that nobody had ever seen, that we were actually able to get back in time and space to a language family, the Indo-European family, and place a proto-language as responsible for that family, as the origin, the parent of that family, which we call Proto-Indo-European. And Proto-Indo-European, you may remember, we had pretty good evidence, was probably spoken at the year 2500 BC in this area of Europe, north of the Black Sea, in the plains of Russia. And although it was one language, it was spoken in many different dialects, and these dialects, so to speak, the speakers of these dialects left at various times. Now, of course, on our program today, we're interested in English. And English is, as we're going to see, a Germanic language. And the Germanic speakers, you may remember, left this particular homeland, we believe, about, well, between 500 and 800 BC, and migrated in this direction, going into these parts of Europe. Now, our job today is again to trace the development of the English language, our language. Our language is a Germanic language, and now what we've got to do is to actually see how a mere handful of what we would call today barbarous pagans were able to spread their language over the face of the earth. Now, when we first find them in history, they were people to whom the names have been assigned Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. And we find them at, say, the year 410, right here on the continent of Europe. Right here along the shores of the Netherlands and up into Denmark, what is now Denmark, right here. Now let's see if we can zero in on these crude and barbarous linguistic ancestors of ours and see how the particular territory, again, closer, that they occupied. The Saxons were along this part. Here's the Ems River, the Weser River, and the Elbe River, and here the Rhine. The Saxons occupied this territory. And please also notice along the shore here we have a group of people known as Frisians. Now the Angles occupied this part of what is now Schleswig-Holstein, and the Jutes this part of what is now Denmark. Now we find, according to history, that when these people left, when they migrated, that all of the Angles left, that the Jutes, most of them left, and about half of the Saxons. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves because I want you to realize that what was happening all through Europe at this time was actually a series of expansions of the Germanic-speaking people. Remember, the Roman Empire was crumbling. 410 AD, Romans were withdrawn from Great Britain. The Romans had been garrisoning Great Britain, but they withdrew their legions in order to fend off other Germanic speakers, Goths and Vandals and Burgundians, who were coming down and sacking Rome itself. So that our linguistic ancestors, this handful of barbarous and pagan people, found out or got the idea that England was fair game. And they started to migrate to England at about the year, say, 415, and by the end of that century, by 500, they had taken over all of England. These Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, then, actually spoke what many scholars would call today one language, but in different dialects. And as we're going to see in just a minute, this Frisian, the language of the Frisians, was also extremely closely related. But I want to leave them here on this kind of a map now, a geographical map, and see if we can place them in the family, on what we can call a linguistic map, or a linguistic chart, if you will. Here is Proto-Germanic. This was the reconstructed language we spoke about on our program last week, which we were able to reconstruct as the parent, although we had no texts for it, to account for all of the Germanic languages, all of the related Germanic languages. Now, Proto-Germanic dates about 1 AD. But again, here is English down here, and this is, of course, the subject of our program, English. Now, I'd like to show you how we divide the Germanic family. We divide it into East and North and West, 3 groups. The Proto-East Germanic language was the one that was responsible for Gothic, which we noticed in our last program. Vandal and Burgundian and other East Germanic languages, we have practically no textual remains, but we know that they were East Germanic languages. The North Germanic languages, Old Norse, spoken around 900 or 1000, is responsible for modern Icelandic, Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish, the Scandinavian languages. But the one we're particularly concerned with is Proto-West Germanic, or the West Germanic group, coming from this particular proto-language, and we can divide the West Germanic group into 2 halves. Proto-Anglo-Frisian, the one we're particularly concerned with, and Proto-German. From Proto-German comes modern Dutch and modern German, modern High German, as it's called. From Proto-Anglo-Frisian now, and remember the Frisians and the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes were all very close together. From Proto-Anglo-Frisian comes Old English, Old Frisian, Modern Frisian, and Modern English. Now, the Old English period is the period, of course, after our linguistic ancestors took the opportunity to get into England and conquer it, and did in that period of about 80 years. And now what I want to do is to show you how they occupied, our Old English speakers, how they occupied England. Now, here's a map of England, somewhat cut off, I'm afraid. But the first thing I want to show you is that the Angles came in to the area called the Northumbrian area and the Mercian area. And these were the 2 major dialects of Anglian. And remember, the Angles came over lock, stock, and barrel, didn't leave anybody behind. The Angles settled north of the Humber River, Northumbria, and south of the Humber and north of the Thames in Mercia. Now, the Northumbrian dialect of Old English, in this particular map here, would be for around, say, 600 A.D., about the time of the Christianization of England. The Northumbrian dialect is important to us because all of the first literature in Old English was done in this dialect. The great epic Beowulf was done in Northumbrian, and many of the early Christian poems. The Mercian dialect area is important to us because actually it is this dialect of Old English that is most directly the ancestor of the modern English we speak today, particularly in this part right around here where the city of London now is. And the third most important is the West Saxon. In many ways, this particular dialect area is the most important to us because Alfred the great West Saxon king, actually translated all of the Northumbrian literature into West Saxon because he was a great patron of learning and the arts, so that actually all the texts we have of Old English are, so to speak, translations or transliterations from the Northumbrian dialect into West Saxon. And of course the Kentish dialect, where the Jutes came in this part of Kent. But again, it's Alfred that I'm particularly concerned about, not only as a patron of the arts and learning, but also as a great statesman and a great soldier. Because after the English, that is the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, came to England, for some years they fought among themselves, for almost 200 years. But from 790 on, Danes, again part of this great expansion of the Germanic-speaking peoples, Danes began to come and make attacks across this, along this coast, along the North Sea. And Alfred fought a lot of inconclusive battles with the Danes. But finally, in the year 878, he won a conclusive victory over Guthrum, the Danish leader, and concluded a peace with Guthrum. Now, we might think, in looking back at this, on this in history, that Alfred really lost his shirt in this particular deal, because what he did literally was to give the Danes 1/2 of England and took the other half for himself. But he didn't lose his shirt. Actually, that particular treaty allowed England to go on in peace for 200 years. And here is England at the Treaty of Wedmore in 878. And notice that it was divided right down the middle here. Here was Danish Northumbria, Danish Mercia, the kingdom of Guthrum himself, English Mercia, and, of course, Alfred's West Saxon kingdom. In other words, this particular division, and this is called the Danelaw. That means this part was the Danes' realm, and this part, of course, is the English realm, went right along an old Roman road called Watling Street. And Danes and English now settled down side by side and lived, so to speak, quite happily for 200 years. And this is what this particular peace allowed to happen. The Danes gradually gave up speaking Danish and spoke English and became Christianized themselves. Now, this particular settlement here was, as I say, a very important thing for England because it allowed England to go on in peace. Now, what I'm going to do is to leave our particular linguistic ancestors now at the Treaty of Wedbourne, 878, and tell you something about vocabulary. That is, how vocabulary, the growth of a vocabulary, can be used to see actually the growth of a culture, to see how the way of life of a people actually changes by the kinds of words they add to their vocabulary, whether they borrow those words, for instance, from another language, or whether they actually make up from their own word stock new words to cover new concepts, new ideas, and new things. In other words, loan words and additions to vocabulary are probably the best indication we have of finding out how people change. Now, to go way back again to our Anglo-Saxons and Jutes on the continent, the first great impact of another language with another culture came when all of the Germanic speaking peoples were living together at about 1 AD with various dialects, of course. But all of the Germanic people came in contact with the Romans, because the Romans had set up a whole series of camps and bastions along the frontier they had with the Germans to keep the Germans back, because the Germanic-speaking peoples were on the move, as we've said. And our rude and barbarous linguistic ancestors, along with other Germanic-speaking peoples, found the civilization of the Romans tremendously high in contrast to theirs. And it's amazing that actually, to them, the simplest to us ordinary things must have been amazingly new and different. One of the reasons we know this is that the Romans, when they were up there permanently garrisoning those places, didn't have any post-exchanges as modern armies do, and the little creature comforts of the soldier who was permanently garrisoned there were met by a group of peddlers who actually carried their stocks on sacks on their backs and came up from Rome and sold and bought little things and trinkets and so on, and gave, you know, needles and threads and things like that, and the things that the soldiers needed, and also wine. These men were called calpones. And that word calpones, which referred to these peddlers, who were the mobile post-exchanges of the times, that word was borrowed into every Germanic language. It appears in German as the word kaufen, which is to buy in German. And in Old English we find chiapian, again, which came from calpones, and chiapian meant to buy and sell, to exchange. Modern English, the word cheap comes directly from these particular peddlers with their packs on their backs, and the district in London called Cheapside is not just cheap real estate, it means actually, of course, the market side of the city of London. So that the name of these particular people spread all through the Germanic languages, and it tells us how important was what they brought to the Germanic-speaking peoples. Because for the first time the word wine occurs. We know that wine was never known before these men brought wine up there. At this time also we find that the simplest little cooking utensils were given to the Germanic-speaking peoples for the first time. The word for kitchen in English and Küchen in German actually again comes from the Kokina, the little cooking pots that these men sold to the Germanic-speaking peoples. In other words, we can find then that the simplest and the most important kind of cultural contacts of people on people are going to be reflected in the vocabulary. Now, Christianity. Christianity came to England, and England was completely Christianized by 600. We would expect, and we do find at this point, a tremendous number of new words coming into the English vocabulary. We find, obviously, words for bishop, words for archbishop, monk, nun. These kinds of words obviously had to come in because the whole of Christianity was a new idea, new institutions. So we would expect new words, and they were borrowed directly from Latin and Greek in this case. But what interests us about our vocabulary at this time were not so much the words that were borrowed as the words that weren't borrowed, and how the English vocabulary met this challenge of a new idea by making up the word from its own word stock. In other words, the word acolyte, for instance, was not borrowed, but instead it was translated. So that we find acolyte occurring in one case as tapper barond. Tapper meaning the taper or the candle that was held in the procession. Barond, of course, the one who was carrying it, the taper carrier or the candle carrier. Another one, the husselthane. Hussel being an Old English word which meant sacrifice before they were Christian, now used for the Eucharist. In other words, the word for Eucharist was not borrowed. They took the old word and put it on for the Eucharist. So a husselthane, thane meaning servant, was a Eucharist server. So here's another way they translated the idea of acolyte out and used native words. God, a native word. Sin, a native word. Easter, the name of a pagan festival. In other words, over and over again, gospel itself, goda spell, meaning the good story. This is what the gospel is. In other words, over and over again, they translated rather than borrowed. So this is a very interesting thing to see how people can resist. Now, what happened when the Danes came? Well, when the Danes came, again, the Danes were very close in every way, in culture and language, to the Old English. And again, this business of separating England into these two halves, there was tremendous interchange, very close interchange between the Danes and the English. And we therefore find not complicated new words that are coming into the English vocabulary, but the very blood and bone words of the language itself. It seems incredible to us that some of the most ordinary words in English we use today are Danish words. To call, to get, to give, to kill, to die. Bread, eggs. All of these things are Danish words, not English words. We can see how the common coin of language must have passed back and forth across the Danelaw. Even more important, we find that Danish words that the Danes actually gave us are pronouns. They, them, and their, and she, probably. Certainly they, them, and their come from Danish. And the verb to be itself in the plural, in the present, we are, you are, they are, the word are comes from Danish. I know of no other case in the history of language, connection and interconnection, where things as basic as the verb to be, or its equivalent, and pronouns have been borrowed from one language to another. In other words, then, we find that the kind of cultural interchange that happened between the Danes and the English was vastly different than what happened when English was Christianized. And when we find the Norman conquest coming, then we find something vastly different. 1066, the date that every schoolboy knows, of course. William the Norman comes, and remember the Normans only 2 or 3 generations before were expanding Germanic speakers again. They had come from Scandinavia, had conquered the northern part of France, had given up speaking the North Germanic language, and were now speaking French, and had taken over all of French culture, a much more highly feudalized and, to us, much more advanced culture than the culture of the English and the Danes. So, we find then coming in to English, as a result of the Norman conquest, all of the legal words, tremendous number of new words for religion and the church, all of the words having to do with household furniture, like the word for chair, for instance. In other words, it replaced the word for stool because the Normans actually had a seating device that had arms and legs and a back, whereas the English stool obviously didn't have any arms and legs and a back. The whole business of the cooking. Out on the range, we called it a cow. Out on the range or in the pen, it was called a swine. Bring it to the table, and it's called pork if it's cooked by the French in the new way, and beef. In other words, a whole series of new words coming in now which show legal, military words, the words for war and peace. Duke and Duchess are added to the vocabulary. A much higher civilization now. But again, in the literature of the period, there is, for 200 years, in what is written in English, no French words are written at all. It's as though that our writers at that period said, if we just don't pay any attention to the Normans, maybe they'll go away. In other words, there were no French words that came in until around 1250. And at that point, actually the Norman kings were no longer felt to be Normans, no longer thought of themselves as Normans. They thought of themselves as English, and they thought of their Norman cousins now as being their enemies. So now they were well anglicized, and now the floodgates were out, and bang, comes in tremendous numbers of French words into the literature. By 1400, the time we get to Geoffrey Chaucer, we will see that any part of English that was written would have a tremendous number of French words. In Flanders, Willem was a compagnie of young folk that haunted in folies, riot, hazard, stewards and taverns, whereas with harpers, lutes, and guitars, they danced and played at days both day and night, and ate also and drink of ihre Mischt. Look at the tremendous number of French words for various kinds of musical instruments, the word for company, hazard, riot, the word for Flanders, dancing, playing at dice, all of these words now coming in and showing the tremendous impact that French culture had, Norman culture had on the Old English. Now, of course, within a very short period of time, just about at 1400, there was French ceased to be spoken, really. In other words, English goes on now with its new vocabulary enriched with French words. It goes on now as a language able to handle a much more complicated kind of societal structure. But it goes on as English. French disappears. So then, to summarize what we've said, we actually find that we are going to have, any time we find peoples coming together, we're going to have a change in the way in which they talk, because there is going to be a change in the way in which they live. Now, from that particular period on, up through the Renaissance and since then, English has spread, obviously, all over the face of the earth. By the time the Renaissance comes in, we know perfectly that, well, it's about the time of Elizabeth, the Great Expansion. Here goes English across to North America. English goes down under to Australia, to India, and everywhere it goes, it borrows words, borrows words, borrows words. It is truly a world language now spoken by 275 million people, and a vocabulary that has from words from American Indian, Eskimo, and from languages all over the face of the earth. But there are other world languages than English. In fact, there are a great many languages on the face of the earth, and here on our board are, in various colors of gray shadings here, some idea of the tremendous number of languages that there are. Here is English, of course, spoken in England and shown throughout this entire area, shown in Australia and South Africa and so on. English, with 275 million speakers, has more native speakers than any other language in the face of the earth, except for Chinese, as we'll see in just a moment. Now, other world languages. Russian, that is continental Russian, not Ukrainian or White Russian, has 153 million. Probably with White Russian and Ukrainian would go over well over 200 million, being second to English. German has, if I remember correctly, about, 93 million, something like that. French, perhaps a little more than that. French, 70. These figures are hard to come by and are not too accurate. But we do have, from the Indo-European family, world languages, Spanish, German, French, Russian, as well as English. And between them, they account for a tremendous number of people on the face of the earth. But there are other language families, actually, other than Indo-European, in Europe. Finnish, which is a Finno-Ugric language, an Altaic language, which is Turkish, spoken here, Basque and Caucasian languages. However, the thing I want to call your attention to now is Chinese. Chinese is said to have 600 million native speakers. But that is, I believe, because we think of Chinese as one language because it's written in one way. There are actually about 8 different Chinese languages which differ among each other as much as, say, English does from Russian, or Swedish does from Russian, let's say, or Swedish does from Spanish. Closely related, and they use the same writing system, but they are really different languages. So I would say that English is probably, at the present time, the most important world language there is, but it is, again, not the only world language, and Russian is certainly challenging it as far as being a world language goes, and there are other languages than world languages on the face of the earth. I'd like now to come to North America, just to look at language families that were actually among the North American Indians. You know, we think of perhaps of the Indians just speaking Indian, but when the white man came here at the time of the expansion, around the Renaissance period, the Elizabethan period, when the English settled along this coast, they met speakers of the Algonquin Indian family, which actually spread over this entire area here. Where my pointer is going shows the tremendous spread of the Algonquin family, a family like the Indo-European family, with many languages, Arapaho and Blackfoot out here in the west, Narragansett and Powhatan here along the coast, but a tremendous family here, Cree, up through this area. Here the Iroquoian languages, those spoken among the 5 nations up in New York State. And Athabascan languages, covering this tremendous territory here and this tremendous territory here. Navajo, that we've mentioned on this program, is an Athabascan language. In other words, 11 families, and many, heavens knows how many individual American Indian languages. Again, there are many languages on the face of the earth, a tremendous number of languages. Now, at this point, people always ask a question. They always say this: should there be only one language? Can there be only one language? Do we need all these languages? Is there anything we can do, perhaps about making people speak one language? Wouldn't mankind's ills all disappear overnight if everybody only spoke one language? Well, I can tell you that this is a hard question to answer, but the linguists would answer it like this. He would say it's not so much a question of the language. It's much more a question of the culture. In other words, as we've seen, language and culture are inextricably interwoven. And if people have different ideas, values, and assumptions, even though they speak the same language, they're not likely to get along. Or perhaps they're still likely to have trouble. Let me put it that way. It is very true that probably as Western culture spreads over the face of the earth, as it's continuing to do, the variety of the Western European kind, and now, if you will, the Russian kind that is spreading more and more, people are going to want to learn to speak these languages. In other words, there's nothing you and I can do, any of us as Americans, to stop people from wanting to learn English. They will learn English in every possible way they can. English is probably required by more school systems in more nations than any other subject I know. I believe that people say that it's required to be studied for 10 years in the school system of Russia. Just think of this. In other words, people are going to learn English because it's important for them to learn English. People are going to learn Russian. Now, a manufactured language like Esperanto, or a sort of altered language, simplified language like Basic English, I'm afraid these kinds of things are not the answer very much to our problem. I really believe that as more and more there becomes a communality of culture, probably more and more languages will disappear in favor of the world languages. And in another generation or two, who knows? Maybe there will be 1,000 fewer languages on the face of the earth, and more people speaking languages that are more and more structurally similar because their culture, their attitudes, and their assumptions are going to be similar. In other words, I'm afraid I don't believe that we could settle our world problems today by all of us speaking immediately one language. This takes time. Now, to summarize what we said today, we have tried to show you the spread of the language of a group of barbarous pagans, a handful of men, who somehow or other were able to spread their language all over the face of the earth until it becomes a true world language. And we did this by tracing vocabulary as the most convenient way of seeing the impact of other people on this particular language. Now, in our next program, we're going to be talking about writing, man's second greatest invention. And what we're going to do is to trace the history of the alphabet. We're going to trace the history of the alphabet from the earliest form, the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and see how that alphabet traveled all through Europe, all through the rest of the world. Be with us then, won't you?
This is National Educational Television.